Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Aquinas and God and how we come to know things about God. Aquinas says that whether or not God exists is a question appropriate for human reason. The human reason can investigate an answer to that question. And in doing so, he opens a space for it being reasonable to believe that God exists. And that's, of course, what he wants. And he'll give us reasons for that. But in so doing, it's a double-edged sword. He also opens space for it being unreasonable to believe that God exists, or put differently, for it to be reasonable to think that God does not exist. So that the question whether or not God exists is something that reason can make a claim on, reason can investigate, human reason can investigate, opens the path for two different answers. Yes, God exists, that's reasonable, that's one answer. Or no, God does not exist, that's not reasonable, that's a second answer. And the problem of evil is by far the most powerful weapon that can be used by the atheist, he who believes there's no God, to justify their beliefs, to try to put evidence for there being no God. And the problem of evil is the more powerful evidence, and weapon. There's another kind of weapon though, but this one's not really, and this has been around for a long time as well. And this is not really to show that God doesn't exist, but it's something slightly different. This weapon can be used to show that it is unreasonable to believe in God, whether or not God exists. So the point of this other objection to believe in God is not to show that God doesn't exist, but rather that whether or not God exists, it is unreasonable to think so. And here's a kind of analogy. So there are stars, right? There are stars in the universe. And arguably, there's a finite number of stars. It's extremely large, but still finite number. And numbers are either even or odd. You know that all of those are facts. So it's the number of stars is either even or odd. It seems like that's like has to be one of those two. So it could very well be that the number of stars is even. That could be true. However, it is just beyond our capacities to count. It is just beyond our capacities to settle that question. That even though it could very well be that the number of stars is even, it is still irrational or foolish, or there's something wrong about believing that the number of stars is even if it's true, because we can't know that it is true. Something like that is what's going on in this other objection. It's not really arguing that God doesn't exist, but rather arguing that we're just not capable of knowing that God exists. So the reasonable conclusion is that God does not exist. And here's what the objection says. And I'm labeling this Occam's razor after William of Occam, of a 14th century great philosopher / theologian. William of Occam was born shortly after Aquinas died. So Aquinas did not use the expression Occam's razor. In fact, Occam himself did not use the expression Occam's razor. But Occam made use of this principle consistently, that now we ascribe it to him as a great theorist that put forth the principle. And it's a principle that is alive and well in scientific and philosophical circles. You might have heard of it referred to as the principle of parsimony, or the claim that simplicity is a guide to truth. So theoretical virtue, if you have two theories, one of which is more simple than the other, you have reason to believe that the simpler one is true precisely because it is more simple. Simplicity is a guide to truth. That's the basic assumption here. And it can be stated in different ways. The way in which I stated it here is no entity should be postulated beyond necessity. If reality can be explained without appealing to an entity, then we shouldn't appeal to that entity. We shouldn't postulate the existence of that entity. And here's how Aquinas actually puts it, but it's the same idea. Quote, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for or explained by few principles has been produced by many. In other words, if you have some phenomena, if you have something that needs to be explained, like the existence of this river in the picture, and you have two explanations, one of which appeals to three principles, and the other one appeals to five principles. What Occam's razor tells you is that we ought to go with the fewer principles. We ought to go with the simpler explanation. Simpler explanations, less complex, fewer principles, those are marks of truth. So when in doubt, when you have two competing explanations, go with the simpler one. That's the basic claim here. And it should all feel very sciencey. Aquinas was a scientist. He was a great scientist. In everything he's doing, including his arguments for the existence of God, he thinks of it as just plain old science. That's what he's doing. So the objection continues. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. A different way of saying the same thing is that we can explain all of nature, the things that we see with our senses, which are the connection to physical reality. We can explain all of physical reality without appealing to God. And because we can do that, then we don't have to appeal to God. And because we don't have to appeal to God to explain anything, we shouldn't appeal to God. And the reason we shouldn't appeal to God is because of Occam's razor. If you have two explanations, one which is purely scientific, no God involved in it, a second which is science plus God, has more complexity, the simpler theory is the one that does not have the new entity God. So the proper scientific way of thinking is to go with the simpler, more parsimonious explanation, which does not include God. So then we explain all of reality. We have perfectly good scientific knowledge without thinking that God exists. And therefore, we don't have any justification for thinking that God exists. Not that this proves there is no God, of course it doesn't, but it becomes something like whether the number of stars is even or odd. It's something that we just cannot know. It puts belief in God beyond the reach of reason. So the objection continues. For all of natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature. In other words, natural explanations suffice to account for natural phenomena. And therefore, there's no need to appeal to God to explain natural phenomena, things that we see with our senses in the physical world. So therefore, postulating God, thinking that God exists as an explanation of reality is superfluous, is unnecessary. Therefore, we shouldn't do it, Occam's razor. And Laplace is also a subsequent thinker. He's known for saying this, so I'm going to put it here. When someone asked him if he provide a physical description of the world after Newton, so a couple of centuries afterwards, someone asked him, oh, so where does God fit into this picture? There's no mention of God. He famously replied, I have no need for that hypothesis. And the assumptions were, because I can explain things without God, it is more reasonable for me to explain them without God. Unless God is providing some explanation that is not being done by other principles, then one should not appeal to God. That's the basic kind of scientific insight here. And Occam is assenting to it, Laplace is assenting to it, Aquinas is assenting to it. Here's what Aquinas says, and this now is the reply to the objection. This is Aquinas' own position. Nature needs to be traced back to God as to its first cause. So Aquinas accepts Occam's razor. He thinks that's a sound way of thinking, a sound principle to think about reality. But he denies that nature can explain natural phenomena, that one can fully comprehend or explain all of reality and physical, empirical reality without appealing to God. Aquinas thinks we can only fully understand and explain the things around us, the things we see, by appealing to God. God becomes kind of the theoretical postulate in Aquinas' scientific thinking that makes intelligible reality. And that's his reply to the argument. Of course, merely to reply this, to say this, is not yet to actually tell us how it is that God explains, and it's only by appealing to God that nature has to be explained. That is the work of the arguments, the ones that we'll look at shortly. But his reply to the Occam's razor objection illustrate his way of thinking. We think of God reasonably as existing because that is the best explanation given the kind of reality we see through the senses. That's why we think reasonably that God exists, because it's the best explanation of reality as we sense it. And the arguments are the ways of fulfilling that promissory note that he gives us in the reply to the Occam's razor. So here is actually working through things we see and how it is that God must exist, or God is the best explanation for reality being the way that we see it. Um, so here's one of the arguments that what Aquinas takes to be the most persuasive argument, the most powerful argument. He calls it the first way to demonstrate that God exists. And it's also referred to as the argument from motion. And the first claim, the first premise in the argument, the first observation is that some things are in motion, and this is evident to the senses. And that's why I have a picture here of a dancing person, and she's dancing, she's in motion. A few words about motion, though. The word motion are in order. For Aquinas, motio, it's best translated as something like change. Many people translate it as motion, and that's fine. But the way in which we contemporary people use the word motion, we just mean something like change in location. You move your arm through the air, right? That's a perfectly good way of using the word motion. For Aquinas, motio is just change. When you go from not knowing to knowing, when you become knowledgeable, that's a kind of motion. That's a transition from having the potential to know to actually knowing. And all transitions from potential to actual are motions. They're transitions, they're changes. So I just think of, we see things changing. That's the data. And for Aquinas, being a scientist, being an empiricist, this is a hook on reality. We know that the conclusion of this argument is real, is true, applicable to the real world, precisely because we begin with the senses. The senses are the starting point of inquiry and investigation. And we begin with the senses, and then reason operates upon the deliverance of the senses, and then we come to know reality. So first observation, we see things that are changing, that are in motion. The world is a changeable world. It's a world of change. That's the first observation. Second observation, a principle of change. And it says, whatever is moved by another. And Aquinas thinks this applies to all change, and it gets complicated how it exactly applies to all changes. For our purposes, I'm going to make it a bit simpler. I'm going to point to a particular kind of change or motion that it should make it transparent and clear. And that's the motion of coming into being or coming into existence. That's a kind of motion, it's a change. So coming into existence. Here's the more precise version of the premise number 2. Whatever comes into existence is brought into existence by another. Some things are in motion. You can look at me, right? I exist. I was brought into existence. That's kind of something that your senses deliver. Premise number 2, whatever came into existence was brought into existence by another thing. And the other thing must have existed, right? That's a basic assumption here in the argument. One can only bring something into existence if the thing that is bringing into existence something else also exists. So if you look at me, you know that I was brought into existence. That's the deliverance of the senses. But because of the kind of thing that I am, a finite, fallible, human being that fades out of existence, you know that I did not bring myself into existence. You know that something else brought me into existence. So even though your senses just give you me, your reason tells you, oh, Juan is here. It was brought into existence by something else that exists, something else that must have existed for Juan to be brought into existence. So that's the second premise. Things you see are in motion, they're in change, they're brought into existence, and something else brought them into existence. Now let's think a bit more about that. So this second mover, that is the thing that brought into existence, the thing that you see. So in my case, you see me, I was brought into existence, that's the deliverance of the senses. Something brought me into existence. I did not bring into existence myself. So the thing that brought me into existence, let's call it the second mover, right? Because it's second as in you see me and there's something that you're not seeing, but it brought me into existence. So it's second in the order of reasoning about change. This second mover, the thing that brought me into existence, either was brought into existence by another, not itself, or not. And this second mover was either itself moved by another, or it was not itself moved by another. So that's supposed to apply to all of change, but again, let's concentrate on bringing it into existence. I came into existence, you see that, something brought me into existence that existed. That thing, the second mover, the thing that brought me into existence, that either itself was brought into existence by something else, a third thing, or not. So here are two options, and that's what premise 3 says. Either something that brought me into existence was brought itself into existence or not. Let's go with the thing that brought me into existence did not, is not the thing that was brought into existence by some other thing. So if the thing that brought me into existence, the second mover, was itself not brought into existence by another, then there is something moving that is bringing things into existence, which is itself unmoved, not brought into existence by anything else. So that's a very peculiar kind of category. This is a very impressive category. It's a thing that exists for it to bring others into existence. It brought me into existence, but nothing brought it into existence. And this is compatible with premise 2. Premise 2 does not say everything that exists was brought into existence by another. It says whatever is being moved is being brought into existence, was brought into existence by another. That's compatible with someone existing and not being brought into existence by another. So there is this peculiar category. I could have been brought into existence by something that itself was not brought into existence by another. That's the unmoved mover. It's unmoved because nothing moved it into existence, and it's mover because it's moving me into existence, it's bringing me into existence. So that category is the category of a being that exists necessarily and that is causing things in this world to come into existence as a creator. That's a very kind of distinctive category. And Aquinas just labels that category God. He says, if there is such a thing, if that's the explanation, let's just call it God. God is the label for this thing that we're reasoning our way to as a way of explaining what our senses see, namely that one has been brought into existence. So that's one of the options. But notice that that's not the only option, right? You might think, well, there's the obvious option that what brought me into existence is the second mover, which are my parents, right? They're other beings like me that were themselves brought into existence. So 3 allows for that, right? 3 says either things like parents that themselves were brought into existence by another, grandparents, or something like God, that it brought things into existence and it does not need to itself be brought into existence. But still, like parents are a legitimate explanation for my existing. So let's talk about them. If this second mover is itself moved by another, if it's like parents, then we can ask of the thing that brought the second mover into existence, namely the third mover, let's call it third in the order of reasoning. We can ask of that third mover. Is that third mover itself brought into existence by another or not? In other words, we're asking the same question about the third mover that we asked about the second mover. And now we have the same 2 options. Either a thing that brought the second mover into existence was itself not brought into existence by something else. So that's a very peculiar category. That's the God, the creator who exists, necessarily brings things into existence, but nothing brings it into existence. Or it's something like grandparents, right? It's another another category, another chain in the link of beings that bring other beings into existence, but themselves are brought into existence by another. So we ask that of the third mover. And notice that I finish the sentence with, and so on. You see a pattern is starting to emerge, right? You see an object, myself, that the senses deliver, and you know that it was brought into existence. You ask, okay, well, everything that came into existence by another, was moved by another. So what about the thing that moved it into existence? Is that, was that brought into existence by another or not? If not, it's God or God-like, let's call it God. And if it was by another, then it's like parents. Let's ask of those. Were those brought into existence by things, by a God-like or other beings that were themselves brought into existence? And you keep going asking at each link of the chain. And one possibility at each link of the chain is that that's the starting point, because God is the one that initiated. That's the beginning of the chain. So like the story of Adam and Eve would be a good example of, at one point it ends with Adam and Eve. The great grandparents are Adam and Eve. They did not have any parents. God brought them into existence, and then God himself was not brought into existence. That remains a possibility. The other possibility is the chain just keeps going on. It's an infinite chain of beings that are finite, that bring other finite beings into existence. That's one possibility. But here's the crucial next premise. The series of movers, the series of things that are bringing into existence other things that are themselves being brought into existence cannot be infinite. And hold on to that premise. We'll try to defend it more, of course, as a crucial premise. If we grant it for now, if we keep it as part of the argument, here's what follows. Therefore, there is something moving which is itself unmoved. At some point in the chain, there's a starting point, there's an origination of the chain of motion, of chain of being into existence that just is the creator. So they just label it God. This story presupposes six, that is that the series cannot be infinite, the series of movers cannot be infinite. Why should we think six though? Here is a similar kind of question. And investigating this question makes us think why we should think six is the right one. So here's a picture. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I really like this picture. It's pretty cool. So for a moment, forget what you know about physics, because we have a very different picture now. But begin with a basic question. Like you have a thing like a pen. You drop it, it falls, right? Physical things go down. They drop unless they're being held up, right? I'm holding it up with my hand. If I'm holding it up, it doesn't fall down. If I let go, it falls. That's how all physical things seem to behave, at least. So then we ask, okay, well, when I drop the pen, it falls on the ground. And why doesn't it keep falling? Well, because the ground is holding it up, right, Abby? There is a thing that we see, a thing, object falls. It requires an explanation, something that holds it up as the explanation for why it doesn't keep falling. And the ground becomes that the ground is holding it up. And then you may ask, okay, well, what's holding the ground up, right? If, for example, the pen were to fall on my desk, you may say, well, what explains the pen not falling any farther, being held up, is that it fell on the desk and the desk is holding it up. You may think, okay, that's fine, but why is the desk not falling? Why is the desk being held up? And you may think, well, it's because it's sitting on the floor. And the floor is explaining why the desk is not falling. And the desk is explaining why the pen is not falling. But then you may think, well, why is the floor not falling? Because it seems to be made of the same material. If things like that fall, why doesn't the floor fall? And you might say, well, the floor is sitting on concrete, and the concrete is holding it up. And you might say, well, why is the concrete not falling? Well, it's sitting on the earth, right? At some point, you're going to hit it was sitting on the earth. But then we ask, why is the earth not falling? And here's an old story. It's an old story about explaining why it is that the earth doesn't fall. Well, the earth is not falling because it's being held up. It's sitting on top of 3 elephants, and you see the elephants in this picture. So, so far so good. We can explain why it is that the pen is not falling. It's not falling because it's being held up by something, and we just said it's being held up by something, and so on, right? So the series of explanations for the phenomena that we observe, namely the pen stopping from falling, not falling anymore, has reached the 3 elephants. And then we might wonder, why are the elephants not falling? And the typical story goes like, well, there's a giant turtle, and the giant turtle it's holding up the elephants. And then you might think, okay, why isn't the turtle falling? Like the turtles that I know fall. Like why isn't that one that's a lot bigger just because it's bigger? And you might think, well, unless I know why the turtle is not falling, I still don't have an explanation for why the pen is not falling. Unless the turtle somehow accounts for its own ability to not fall, then the elephants and the earth and the floor and the desk and so on, I'm still not done explaining why the pen is not falling. And one of the stories that came out of this is this cool picture. Well, actually, beneath the turtle is another turtle that is holding it up. And beneath that second turtle is a third turtle that is holding it up. And beneath that one is another, and so on. You see the picture, right? It keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going. And you may ask, well, is there a bottom? Is there something such that it explains why it is not falling and why everything that's on top of it is also not falling? And one possibility is, oh yeah, there's a thing that is different in nature, that is not the kind of thing that is being put into motion by another, not the kind of thing that is being held up by something else. And that explains it. Or that's one option, that's the God picture. And the other one is, oh no, it just keeps going down. There are turtles all the way down. I don't know if you've heard that expression. It's grounded in this picture, or the story behind this picture. Something explains something we see, and there's a subsequent thing that explains it. And the series of beings that do the explanation just keeps going on infinitely. The premise number 6 in the previous argument says this picture is about turtles going all the way down, meaning infinitely. There's no end. That's impossible. That's irrational. That cannot be it. I don't need to know enough about physics to know that that story has to be false, like, or at least it's not an intelligible story. What's holding the whole thing up? Like that cannot be the right story. That's the basic assumption. That's the basic kind of insight behind Aquinas's argument. It cannot be turtles all the way down. There must be something that is holding up the whole chain, such that the chain is intelligible. Let's stop here. We'll keep talking about this next time. See ya.